I'm obviously horrified by Trump's election, but I don't see it as a major break. I see Trump as embodying the system. He's like the sort of the dark face of the political system, but he's not different to it. He doesn't stand outside it. He just personifies it.
Welcome to a new episode of Boontjes Doppen, the usual Dutch podcast which is having its first few international guests. The guest of today is zoologist, journalist, political commentator and writer of many books, George Monbiot. As an interviewer, I don't think it's right to pick favorites, but this conversation with George must be somewhere up there. If you like the podcast, do consider giving it a good rating. As I am fully independent and produce everything by myself, I don't make any money off of this. So that would be the way to support me. And do follow me on social media to be up to date on what I'm making. Alright, enjoy. Okay, so I want to start off with, you wrote a column about bullying. And you began with, a large and impressive study of children's progress into adulthood found that those who display bullying and aggressive behavior at school are more likely to prosper at work. To you, my question is, why would that be?
I think that's what the system's set up for. You know, that is what the workplace is set up for. It's all about competition. It's all about treading on other people's heads and getting to the top. It's what political life is set up for. Unfortunately, in a lot of societies, is what family life is set up for. You know, the man is going to dominate the woman. You're going to bully your way into that pole position within the family as well. And you know, it reflects a much wider issue within society. You know, if the bullies come to the top in the workplace, it's not that that's the natural order of things. It's that there's something wrong with the workplace. And there's something wrong with society that allows that workplace to be dominated by bullies. And so what I was arguing in this article is, you know, we don't surrender to the bullies. We create a society with safeguards that prevents the bullies from dominating, a society based on kindness and empathy and decency, a society which is genuinely democratic as opposed to this pseudo-democracy, this highly centralized system which calls itself democratic, but everything is remote from us. A system which can very easily be captured by the worst bullies of all, like Donald Trump.
So you're saying the current system we have is not democratic?
No, it's democratic in only the shallowest sense. So when, for instance, in the UK, my own country, you know, when these liberal reformers said, well, maybe we should allow working men to have the vote. And then later on, well, maybe we should allow women over 30 to have the vote. And then, you know, gradually just expanding the number of people who could vote. It looked as if they were handing over the keys to power to the population, but they were doing no such thing. They kept in place the political systems which had been there before hardly anyone had the vote. I mean, you look at the symbol of Parliament in the UK. So at the top of it, there's a crown, right, which means unaccountable power. Underneath it, there's a portcullis, you know, that spiked gate which comes down in front of a castle, which means exclusion. And on either side of it, there are chains, which means slavery and servitude. You know, that's the symbol of Parliament. And when something tells you what it is, believe it. Similarly, in the US, when the so-called founding fathers of the US set up their system, they had some high ideals. You know, they were trying to do something good, but they couldn't let go of their own privileges. And they couldn't say, people like us will be no more important than anybody else. They couldn't say the slaves shall have an equal say in the nation, an equal vote. They couldn't say we will create systems which enable everyone to rule, everyone to exercise political power. So instead they set up this system which was democratic in that there's an election once every 4 years. But in between, it's all presumed consent. You know, whichever country we're in, we'll elect a government. And then for the next 4 or 5 years, that government can do whatever it can push through Parliament. And if you challenge it, say, well, you elected us, in which case you say, well, I didn't. maybe 40% of the voters elected you, but it wasn't me who elected you.
Yeah.
So I don't actually consent to anything. But also, all these things you're doing in our name. No one voted specifically for any of those things. Some of them might have been on your platform. You might have listed a few of those things you were going to do, but no one ever reads the whole platform. No one ever votes on the whole platform. They vote on one or two issues. A whole lot of stuff wasn't in the platform anyway, but you presume consent for everything you want to do for the next 4 or 5 years. Now, we don't accept the principle of presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics?
Are you also saying that this is the case in many other countries, such as the Netherlands, where I'm from?
Yeah, I mean, all these systems are founded on similar principles. Some are slightly better than others. You've got proportional representation. We have this mad, crazy system called first past the post politics, which is overtly designed to keep elite power in place. So yours are slightly better, but only slightly. It's still a centralized system, and that is the fundamental problem. Power is a long way away from any of us. It's in one place. It's in a building, and that building is remote from our lives. And the concerns of the people in that building are far too remote from our lives.
Is that the only place where power rests right now?
Oh, of course, there are local authorities, but they don't wield the real power. The real power.
How about oligarchs?
Well, of course, I mean, it's become even worse in that these structures of power have been hollowed out. It's what I call the neutron bomb model of politics. You get a neutron bomb is an atom bomb which produces a huge amount of radiation, but not a lot of destructive power. So the structures remain intact. The buildings are still there, but everything inside them is dead. And so, we still have the parliaments going through the motions, but power has actually migrated elsewhere. It's an offshore group of oligarchs whose investments are offshore. They come and go. In this country, we've got Rupert Murdoch, born in Australia, an American citizen, but telling us what to think. And he's the real power in this country. He's far more powerful than any government. A government cannot be elected without his blessing. He's the kingmaker here. So we have these structures which are A, inadequate anyway and remote from us, but B, have now been hollowed out, as you rightly point out. And we're expected to say, oh yeah, we're happy with this system. This is not a democratic system. I'm obviously horrified by Trump's election, but I don't see it as a major break. I see Trump as embodying the system. He's like the sort of, he's the dark face of the political system, but he's not different to it. He doesn't stand outside it. He just personifies it. And a true democracy would be one where we have much more day-to-day running of our own lives and of the issues which affect our lives. A participatory, deliberative, locally based democracy of the kind that, for instance, the political philosopher Murray Bookchin proposed, of the kind that they pursued in the city of Porto Alegre in Brazil between 1989 and 2004, where the budget for the city was set by the people. Prior to that, the city had been run by the mafia, in effect. And so all the money was thrown into the mafia's pockets. No one benefited. Porto Alegre was bottom of the Human Development Index for the state capitals in Brazil. And then a new local government came in, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT government, and said, this is never going to work. It's never going to work to have a bunch of people sitting in City Hall saying, here is how we're going to spend your money. It's only going to work if you, the people, decide how your own money is going to be spent. And so, first of all, they let the people of the city design the process. I mean, this was a sort of radical trust they were putting in people. And then they let them run the process. And everyone was saying, well, this can never work. The people are idiots. How can we trust the people to run their own lives? That's right. It's so much better if we have an elite who we choose to do it. But what we see again and again is that participatory democracy works much better in practice than it does in theory. And the reason for that is that it transforms the people who engage in it. You become a democratic citizen. You say, oh my God, I've got this power and I'm sharing it with all these other people. We've got to do this responsibly. And what we saw is that in Porto Alegre, it was the poorest citizens who engaged most, and a lot of them were illiterate. And you'd say, well, how can these people have a voice in politics? They can't even read or write. But people are savvy. We don't give the innate intelligence of humankind enough credit. And people know how to make things work. And what we saw coming out of there were much better, much fairer, much greener, much more long-term decisions than had previously been made in the city. And we saw a massive improvement in primary health care, in education, in maternal mortality stats, in infant mortality stats, in sanitation, in clean water, in public transport. And Porto Alegre went from being bottom of the index for human development in Brazil to the top placed city, right at the top, just in a few years, solely because of it. Now, the question is, why can't we all have this? Why isn't this the default mode of politics? Why isn't this normal? Why does it have to be so unusual? Because it's not a democratic system.
Yeah, that does tie together kind of in a way to the article I just started our conversation with, which also concluded hierarchy causes bullying. But here in Porto Alegre, we kind of see the exact opposite, how it's the environment of the people that shape them to be better people, right?
That's right, exactly. We all absorb the cues from our social environment. We think, we have this image of ourselves as this isolated being who has this sort of godlike knowledge which just comes from nowhere, but no, we're constantly reflecting that social environment all the time in ways which we're often completely unconscious of. We often have no idea why we believe what we believe, because we're just absorbing it from people around us. And if you live in a society that is basically kind, you will absorb and reflect kind values. And if you live in a society that's basically cruel, you will absorb cruel values and reflect those. And psychologists have words for these values. So values which are about empathy and connection and belonging and kindness, decency towards other people, just being happy in yourself, being happy with the things around you. Those are called intrinsic values. And values which are all about fame and power and wealth and image and status, those are extrinsic values.
Yeah.
And we have a society which valorizes extrinsic values. All the time on our screens, being beamed into our mind all the time is extrinsic values. You should be rich, you should be famous, you should be powerful. Your life is not worth living unless you have those things. Rather than, in my view, the reality is that what makes life living is love, is connection with other people, is community, is just being happy in yourself, not constantly raging against what you don't have, but taking joy in what you do. And obviously, we need to have all our needs met, our basic needs met, but then to say, okay, I've got it, I've got there, I have enough. Let me give you an example. Sorry, I'm ranting.
No, go on.
I'll give you an example. So round here, so we're in South Devon, beautiful part of England. I'm so happy and delighted to live here. I feel it's such a privilege. Anyway, one of the amazing things that has happened recently is that bluefin tuna have been coming to the coast here. Now these are fish about 4 meters long. They get to 4 meters long. They can weigh 500 kilograms or more. And they used to live around here. We used to have a really rich marine environment until we trashed it with industrial fishing. Yeah, I mean, all sorts. We had whales in the estuaries. We had, halibut the size of doors. We had so in shallow water, just there. We had shoals of herring, tens of miles long. We had huge shoals of sharks. I mean, this was one of the richest marine ecosystems in the world. It's all been completely trashed by.
Where are you talking about, the North Sea or?
No, all around Britain.
Oh, all around Britain. Yeah.
Yeah, but in the North Sea too. There were oyster beds stretching from us to the Netherlands.
Really?
Yeah, it was just oysters all the way across, and the sea was clear. The North Sea was clear because the oysters stabilised the seabed and filtered out all the sedimentary particles. Anyway, bluefin tuna have come back, partly because the sea's heating, but partly because there's been a slight relaxation of fishing pressure. And there's a place just 5 miles from, no, 6 or 7 miles to 10 kilometers from here. There's a place where you can stand on the shore, on the rocks, and they leap out of the water so close that you get splashed by them. At a certain time of the tide, all the small fish that they feed on are concentrated in this area, and the tuna come roaring in, and they can swim at 70 kilometers per hour. And so they see the bait fish on the surface, and they come up to catch them at this great speed, and they overshoot, and they'll come 2 or 3 meters out of the water, and it's come down with a great splash, and you're that close that you can be soaked as the tuna come down. It's unbelievably exciting. Anyway, on the rocks there, almost every day, is a man with a camera and a long lens.
Yeah.
And I got talking to him and said, and seen his photos. He's got the most beautiful photos of these tuna in midair, catching fish in the air. You know, their faces, it's like portraits of these incredible fish. And I said to him, so you know, where do you put these photos? He said, I don't really. I said, well, you've got to have a website. He said, no, I don't have a website. I said, how about social media? No, I don't do social media. Exhibitions? No. So why are you photographing them? He said, because I love it. I thought, yeah, it's true. You know, that's it. That's intrinsic values right there. He just loves doing it, and he's doing it for the satisfaction and to get that perfect portrait of a tuna, not to big himself up, not to get status or power or wealth. He could make some serious money off those photos. No, it's just the love of it. That's intrinsic values. And then going past us, right close to us,
while you're talking,
while we were talking, was this big boat with these 2 rich guys sitting in it. They pay. I've looked it up. They pay £900 a day for this privilege, towing with a fishing rod, towing these lures to catch a bluefin tuna, right? Which now they have to release them again. They're not catching them to eat. They're catching them so they can have a photo with the bluefin tuna.
Yeah.
And a lot of the tuna they catch die because they're warm-blooded, weirdly. The tuna are warm-blooded fish, and they overheat when it can take an hour or 2 to bring them into the boat because they're so fast and strong. And a lot of them die of shock. And it was just like, you want to be the big man to get photographed with this huge fish you've caught. That's extrinsic values. And I was sitting there thinking, right, here's intrinsic values, there's extrinsic values right here in front of it. And I got into an altercation with this boat. I said, why can't you leave them alone? He said, I'm a licensed tuna boat. I said, I don't care. Just leave them alone. Just enjoy them for what they are, not for what you can do to them, for how you can use them as a platform to boast about. Just love it, like the rest of us here are loving it.
You talked about that people are constantly propagated with these extrinsic values. I think what a very common reply, especially from the more liberal side of politics, will be, but people still choose to do that. Because when we talk about these big subjects, inevitably we are talking about if we have a free will or not. How do you look at that question?
So there's an interesting paradox here. I mean, I've talked already about how we absorb the dominant social themes from around us, and so you could say from that, well, then we don't have much free will, do we? You know, we're just creatures of society. We do what we're almost programmed to do by the rest of society. But the paradox is that only when you've got a supportive society around you can you be the person that you might want to be. So, for instance, only if you've got the money to buy a guitar because you're not desperately poor, you can afford a guitar, and then you've got people around you say, oh, you're good at this, you should get guitar lessons, and there are guitar lessons because it's a sort of society which values that sort of thing. And then your guitar teacher says, you're pretty good, you could go somewhere with this, and your family and your friends say, God, you should be on the stage. And then you've got an opportunity to get on the stage and to play your music. Only then can you become the musician that you might be, that might be in there, and can express yourself in that creative way. You need the support of society to do that. If you're completely on your own, if you're in Trump world, where it's like, if you're poor, you stay poor and you fall into the gutter. You don't have an opportunity. You're not going to get a guitar. No one's going to hear your music. No one's going to know if you're a genius or not. So you need society to be that autonomous person. I mean, we're never fully autonomous, obviously, but to have that sense that this is me and I'm comfortable and confident in being who I am. And, I might be playing it just for the love of it. But other people might say, well, I want to hear this too. This is beautiful music. I want to hear your music. And so you can have that exchange. You give them the music, they give you the love, and something beautiful comes out of that. But that's much less likely to happen in a society which says, it claims to be all about individualism. But of course it's not. In a society, in Trump world, it's about obedience. It's about falling into line. It's the opposite of individualism. And broadly speaking, the right talks about individualism, but is extremely collectivist. And the left talks about collectivism, but is extremely individualistic.
A message I got from what you were just talking about is that, and please correct me if I'm understanding this message wrong, but that is Trump is not necessarily the bad guy in the story, and it's more about the system underneath. Do you agree with that?
I think there's always going to be a Donald Trump waiting for the opportunity. And Trump is a bad guy, no question. He's a serial abuser of women. He's a convicted criminal. He tried to launch a coup. He's a really, really bad guy. He's done terrible things, but it's not him. It's the system that enables him. It's a system that enables someone to get so rich or to inherit so much wealth in the first place and be born into a position of power, which is fundamentally wrong, but B, a system which is just made for someone like that to take over. So, it's not that my view of Trump is any different to that of any other liberal-minded person. Yeah, I hate the fucker. But I'm not blaming him for the situation which has empowered him. Yeah. That situation is much, much bigger than Trump.
We reap what we sow.
Yeah.
So in 2008, our current economic system, neoliberalism, showed its failings, but yet we are stuck with the same economic system. Why is that?
Mm-hmm. So neoliberalism is the dominant economic system and political system that surrounds us. And it's as if the people of the Soviet Union hadn't heard of communism. Most people haven't heard of neoliberalism, and yet it dominates every aspect of our lives. And neoliberalism is the means by which capitalism tries to solve its biggest problem, which is this thing we call democracy. Well, it's not really democracy, it's just people having votes, but capital doesn't like that at all. And so in the late 1940s, these slightly crazy people like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises...
The slightly crazy people?
Yes, that's right. Came up with this set of ideas which basically said there should be no restraints on wealthy people. Rich people should be able to do what the hell they want. And anything which tries to create a better world for the poor will end up with Hitler or end up with Stalin. It was one huge slippery slope fallacy is what they proposed. And so you can't have a welfare state. You can't have well-funded public services. Even democracy, or voting rather, is a bad thing because we should be choosing through buying and selling stuff. That should be main road. And most people thought this was an appalling set of ideas. It was a revolting ideology. But the richest people on earth, and literally the richest people on earth, thought, whoa, yeah, this is it. Because this gives us our justification. This says we're the good guys and the people trying to restrain us are the bad guys. And so literally the richest people on earth poured money into this movement and created this sort of international network of academic departments and think tanks and tame politicians and tame journalists to start promoting these ideas. And they became the dominant idea in society. And it didn't matter whether you were Labour or Conservative or Democrat or Republican, everyone eventually became a neoliberal. And neoliberalism has stripped away the protections for the poor has made them rich, much, much richer and much more powerful, and enabled them to dominate our political systems even more. And as a result of that, politics does not meet people's needs. It doesn't answer the needs. Instead, most of the money that societies generate is captured by the very rich, because that's what the system enables. More and more people fall through the cracks. They find it impossible to pay the cost of housing. Rents are allowed to spiral to a ridiculous extent, and you end up with a society of very rich and powerful people and very poor and powerless people. Now, the poor and powerless people, they don't look at our supposedly democratic centralized system and say, yes, well, there are two parties, each trying to do the right thing. Which of these shall we choose? Let's listen to the rational arguments. They say, fuck the lot of them. And why not? I totally understand that impulse. I just want to kick it all over. I completely understand that. There are constructive ways of kicking it over, and there are destructive ways. And unfortunately, the people like Trump enable the destructive ways of kicking it over. But the system is set up in such a way that almost everyone must lose. It doesn't have to be like that. We can build systems where everyone wins.
You also said that after 2008, with the banking crisis, that we had no story. And where there is no story, fascism seeps in.
Yeah. So, sorry, I forgot your original question, which was, it all failed in 2008. I mean, it was like everything that neoliberalism claimed just fell apart. It said, if we deregulate the economy, we'll all be freer and we can make more money and everything will go right. Well, you deregulate the financial system and poof, everyone experiments with these exotic financial instruments to make themselves as rich as possible, and they bring the whole system down. You deregulate environmental protection and poof, the planet turns to dust. It was never going to work. But 2008 was like the moment where the whole system just fell apart. And yet the zombie stood up and started walking again. And that's partly because we didn't produce an alternative story. And we like to think that we're rational, we're highly rational, we make entirely rational decisions, and we don't. We're creatures of narrative. And what we're listening for is a story. We're listening for a compelling story that tells us where we are, how we got here, who we are, and where we're going to go. And the neoliberals are very good at telling a story. They were very clear that that's what they were doing. They were very conscious, we're going to tell this story. And I think what they recognized is that there's a particular story that works in politics. And that's the one I call the restoration story. And it goes as follows. The world has been thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious forces working against the interests of humankind. But the hero or heroes will confront those powerful forces against the odds, overthrow them, and restore harmony to the land. This is a very familiar story, right? It's the Lord of the Rings story. It's the Narnia story. It's Star Wars, Harry Potter, the Bible. The story comes up again and again. It's one of the great narratives, but it's the one that always works in politics. So the neoliberals can say, the world has been thrown into disorder by the powerful and nefarious forces of the state, which is trying to corral us all into a collectivized system. And the hero is the entrepreneur who's going to overthrow the state, right? And before them, you had the social democrats, people like John Maynard Keynes, who used the same narrative structure, but the powerful and nefarious forces were the very rich who were trashing everyone else's lives, and the heroes were the working and the middle classes who were going to overthrow them to create an enabling state that distributed wealth and restored harmony to the land. Opposite stories, but the same narrative structure. Now, neoliberalism collapses in 2008, and we come forward with nothing, no new story. We don't have a new restoration story to replace it with. And as a result of that, people were standing around saying, well, what now? And some people were saying, how about a little bit less neoliberalism? And other people will say, well, let's go back to that social democracy thing we had before. You can't go back. Unless fascism is very good at going back, but no other No other politics can go backwards. You have to have new stories. And so we ended up with neoliberalism still. It came back and it got even worse. And we've seen neoliberal governments introducing social failure in an even greater extent than before. And as a result of that, people will say, well, fuck, a lot of them will have fascism, please.
Yeah. Throughout your work, neoliberalism comes back many times. Is neoliberalism the problem, or is it one level deeper, and is it capitalism that we should critique?
Sure. So, yeah, neoliberalism is a handmaiden for capitalism. It's capitalism's accelerant. It allows it to continue even in a world where, you know, we can see the huge damage that capitalism does. And you know, the moment you say the word capitalism, oh, you can't say that. You can't say capitalism. You're a communist.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? And it's like, come on, guys, this is our whole system here. You know, yeah, neoliberalism obviously is a sort of political side of that, but underlying it, as you say, it is capitalism. This is our system. If we can't talk about it, how can we solve any of our problems, right? And the fundamental problem is that people don't know what capitalism is. You know, there's a famous phrase attributed to lots of different people, which says, it's easier to envisage the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
I think that's Frederick Jameson.
Yeah, so some people say, and other people say it was Mark Fisher, and there's lots of supposed, yeah, exactly, lots of supposed authors of this. Easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Of course, we can't imagine the end of capitalism. We don't know what capitalism is. You can't imagine the end of something if you can't imagine the thing itself. And people think that capitalism is just commerce. It's buying and selling stuff. Absolutely, it is not that. In fact, in some ways, it's the opposite of commerce. Now, commerce is something that's been done for thousands of years in the world. It's common to loads of societies. But capitalism is something that happened in the 1450s. That's where the origins seem to be. And following the work of the great geographer Jason Moore, I see it as starting on the island of Madeira, roughly in 1450. And this might sound sort of like, whoa, now, come on, this is a bit specific. But so there is a great anthropologist called Karl Polanyi who defined capitalism as embodying the commodification of three things. And what commodification means is a stripping away of all meaning so that you just come down to this thing itself used as a tool, as an instrument. It's nothing except your tool, right? And these three things were commodified. Land, or which we can now say is natural wealth, gets turned into just a tool for making money. Labour, in other words, other people, you turn them into a tool for making money. And money, which gets turned into a tool for making money. And that might seem weird. Well, but money is all sorts of things. You know, money can be a store of value. It can be a unit of exchange. It can be a means of making money. But it was invested with social meanings. You strip all those away. And let's look at the first time when those three conditions are all met at the same time. And a very good candidate for that is 1450 on the island of Madeira. Now, Madeira had been discovered by the Portuguese in 1420.
Discovered.
Right? Yeah. Well, it is a rare example of a genuinely uninhabited place.
Okay, sure.
But, you know, even so. But and they named it Madeira because Madeira is Portuguese for timber, for wood. And this was covered in enormous trees. And they'd run out of trees in Portugal because they cut them all down to build their ships. So they were, whoa, trees, great. Oh, let's call it trees. Yeah. They're
so
very imaginative.
So creative, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so they start doing what they were used to doing. You know, they cut down trees. They ran a few pigs and cattle on the land and stuff. And then some bright spark say, hey, this looks like a good place for growing sugar. And they very quickly discovered it was a really good place for growing sugar. And so they thought, well, we've got the land. This is free land. No one's here. No one can stop us. Yeah. There's no social relation. So back in Europe, you know, the land was all tied up. It was owned by landowners. There were all these social codes around them. There were commoners' rights. The church had rights over it. It was surrounded by social relations. But here, the land has no social relations. It's just a tool. In other words, a commodity. And then they said, right, if we're going to grow sugar, we'll need some labour. Where are we going to get labour? Well, there's no one here. Let's bring in some labour. Oh, if we're bringing in labour, we can bring in anyone. We can bring in slaves. We don't have to pay them. And they first of all brought in slaves from the Canary Islands and then from Africa. And slaves are purely commodified labour. You know, slavery is where you strip away
just labour or commodified humanity or commodified humans.
Humanity, that's exactly right. But you've stripped away people's humanity.
Yeah.
You've denied their humanity.
Right.
You've denied their stories, their culture, their history, their personhood. Everything's gone. They are just labour. There's nothing except that. Is just they've been reduced to this tool to make money, which is called labour. And then money. Well, normally, you know, if you're in Portugal, you'd have to go to the Lord of the Manor to borrow money, and it was completely controlled, and he could charge massive rates of interest. But you say, we don't have to do that here. We can go anywhere. Where's money cheapest? Oh, Flanders, your corner of the world.
Yeah.
Genoa. That's where we can get. So they brought money in from those places, and again, it was just a commodity. It lost all other social meanings. It's just a means by which we can build our sugar plants. And so they sent the slaves out, grow the sugar, cut the wood, because for every kilogram of sugar you need 60 kilos of wood to refine the sugar in the boilers. And they had this massive boom, and very quickly Madeira became the world's premier source of sugar. Yeah, even though it's a tiny island, it was producing more sugar than anywhere else because this system is really efficient, you know. But amazingly, within 30 years, the whole thing crashed. And the reason for that was capitalism, is that you work it and you work it and you work it. No one is stopping you. You can do whatever you want. There are no social constraints. There's no rules. You just grab what you want. It's all commodities. You pour it into your machine and you make money out the other end. As the slaves used up the surrounding forest, because there was no one to say you can't, they then had to go further and further to get wood up the mountains into remote places. And in economic terms, the productivity of labour collapsed. It took like 4 times as much effort and time to get a certain amount of wood. And the whole thing just came crashing down in no time at all. And this is what capitalism does: boom and bust. And then they did something else unique to capitalism. They said, all right, we're not hanging around here. We're fucking off to somewhere else. Quit. Boom, bust, quit. That's what capitalism does. And so they moved to the island of San Tomé, similar situation, screwed that in an even shorter period of time. Boom, bust, quit. They moved to the coast of Brazil. Now, that was inhabited. So what did? They enslaved the local people, right? And then they start importing slaves across the Atlantic. And so they commodify labour there. They grab their land, they seize it, they say, there's no one here because the local people aren't people, they don't count. This is terra nullius, we're going to have this for ourselves. And they bring in the money from Genoa, Flanders, elsewhere, as per usual. The new financial movements networks being created to support this model of exploitation. And then they burn through those lands in Brazil all the way up. And then they get to the Caribbean. And by then, the English had joined in, the Spanish had joined in, the French, the Dutch had joined in, all doing the same thing, and capitalism had got going. And it's a system which booms, it busts, it quits everywhere. It constantly creating new frontiers, ecological frontiers of destruction, but also frontiers, social frontiers where they capture more and more of our humanity, financial frontiers, geographic frontiers. It's just constantly creating and then destroying its own frontiers and moving on. And so when people say, oh yeah, something's gone wrong with capitalism, this is bad capitalism. No, that's just capitalism.
Yeah.
That's what capitalism does.
The system is intended. Yeah. What the Portuguese and other colonizers have been doing to the islands is exactly what we're seeing to the planet right now, isn't it?
Exactly. It's expanded to the planetary level. And so now you've got the new frontier of capitalism. Oh, let's go into space. We've screwed this planet over. Let's go and find another one. That's what capitalism does. Boom, bust, and now they're trying to quit.
All right, let's do something controversial. Let's critique...
Because the rest of this was completely
exactly. Let's critique human rights, but not all of them. One in particular, Article 17. And for the people that don't know it, everyone has the right to own property, alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. What is your critique to this right?
Thank you. So, yeah, this is from the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And you say, okay, I can understand, we should all have our own domain where we, our basic needs can be met. But wait a minute, in that article in the Declaration, they say nothing about what happens to people who don't have property. They say nothing about what happens to future generations. They say nothing about, your property taking away someone else's property. So this idea that we, that it's a universal right is actually undermined by the application of that right. Because without anything to say property can be alienated from some people, it can be moved out of some people's hands and given to a wider group of people, then you end up with the rich having everything and everyone else having nothing. That's how it's going. That's how it's always gone, unless you have a human right for universal ownership of property. We have this bizarre idea that the numbers in your bank account, this arbitrary, weird thing called the money you've accumulated, most of which, it's not physical, it's just literally a number in your bank account, translates into a right to natural wealth. Those numbers mean that because you've got a bigger number in your bank account, you can have more of the surface of the planet than anyone else. And you can exclude other people from those planetary resources because you have an inalienable right, a human right to that property never being taken away from you. And you say, why? So wait, how is that a human right? How is it a human right for some people to have everything and for other people to have nothing? Because that's what that human right means. That's what Article 17 means. Some people can have as much as they want and no one can take it away from them. Well, sorry, but, that deprives a far greater number of their human rights to a decent life. Now, the world I want to see is a world based on the principles of what I call private sufficiency and public luxury. And the thinking behind this goes as follows. The premise of capitalism, the reason why we all go along with it, is that everyone's going to be rich one day. We're all temporarily embarrassed millionaires. One day it's going to be me, right?
Yeah, the meritocracy, it's called, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be my turn soon. Well, it can never work like that because the whole basis of that system is that some people exploit other people. And they take everything away from those other people. If they can, they'll turn them into slaves. They'll seize your land. They'll seize your trees. They'll take everything you own and they'll make it theirs, right? That's how capitalism works. That's how it's always worked. It's never going to be a distributive system. It's a system that concentrates money. Even in periods like from 1945 to 1975 in Europe, where we had a far more distributed wealth in our societies than we had before or since, it was being stolen from the rest of the world just as violently as ever before. And people elsewhere were being made much poorer. And we had a better distribution of the fruits of colonial looting, but it was still coming from colonial looting. And so it's never going to work like that. But what would happen if it did? What would happen if we did all become millionaires overnight? We'd cook the planet in about 10 minutes. Well, for a start, there just isn't the physical space for us to have what multimillionaires have. If we all had our private island and our huge estate and our enormous homes and our yachts and our planes and stuff, where would everyone else live? There's just not enough planet physically for that. But there's not enough ecologically either. The billionaires have a carbon footprint thousands of times bigger than ordinary people. We would just screw the whole system straight away. It would see Earth system collapse in no time at all, right? So you can't all aspire to private luxury. It's never going to work. But we can all aspire to public luxury. Instead of everyone having their own swimming pool and their own tennis court and their own art collection, you have magnificent public swimming pools and public tennis courts and public art collections. And in doing that, you create more space for people, not less space for other people. Because if you could share those public assets, that public luxury, then that's open to everyone. You know, you're not creating a wall around it and shutting people out. So public luxury. But, you know, I'm not against the idea of people owning their own stuff, their small, modest stuff, you know, your decent but not huge home, the things you need to have a decent life. Absolutely. You know, you should have that property. You should own that. But, you know, so private sufficiency, yeah, that sufficiency can be in the private domain, but luxury in the public domain. Private sufficiency, public luxury.
How about factories and hospitals and farms and transportation? So should they also all be in public hands?
Well, see, public is something which people equate with the state. They say, oh yeah, public means state, but it doesn't have to mean state. So for instance, factory can be in the hands of the workers. You know, you can have a workers' cooperative which runs the factory. It's publicly owned, but it's not owned by everyone in the whole country. It's owned by a particular group. Or, you know, your local park can be owned by the community, for instance. It can be a commons. There's lots of different ways of doing it. Some things are probably best run by the state, like a health service, for instance. You know, that a state can run a health service relatively well. Yes, and there have been times when it's run a health service well. You know, we had a pretty good health service until a few years ago in the UK.
Yeah.
You know, and do it much better than a private system like in the US, where it's a total disaster. So, you know, you can have different kinds of public ownership. And, you know, because I like to see things as local and as sort of locally engaged as possible, I want to see a lot more local ownership of crucial commodities. I mean, you know, so our river here, our local river, like everyone's local river in England, is absolutely full of shit because the water companies dump the shit because we have a privatised water ownership in this country is utter madness. But also the farmers, all the cow shit and the pig shit goes down the rivers. You're quite familiar with that in the Netherlands, I understand.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yes. And it's like, wait a minute, you know, who granted private companies the right to destroy a public asset, right? But it's not, and the reason is that it's not treated as a public asset. You know, the river, it's sort of, you know, the state's got some control of it, but it really belongs to no one. Now, what if, you know, the river belonged to the community living in the catchment and also was a sort of a right in its own stead? You know, you have the river having its own rights, but the community upholding those rights. Now, you know, if we were really in charge of the river, you know, we wouldn't allow this to happen. But it's this remote authority saying, leave it to us, we'll sort it out. And who's the people they listen to? The powerful people, the rich people, the people who can pour money into the political parties. They're not listening to us. So it's not going to work so well. It'd work much, much better if we were in charge, if it were a matter of participatory democracy.
All right, I really have to struggle because we have only 10 minutes left and I have many questions, of course. I'm going to try to fit this last one in it because it just fascinates me so much, because this is just something that really surprised me. We had hippos, lions, elephants in Europe until not too long ago.
Yeah. So if you go to the previous interglacial, right, which was the Eemian interglacial, which ended just over 100,000 years ago. All right, before what, you know, the latest ice advance, we had temperatures almost the same as they are today, very similar, and we had a temperate climate just like ours, and we had all the wildlife that we're familiar with. We had foxes, we had badgers, we had robins, we had hedgehogs, we had magpies, we had all the things that you and I might see around today.
Yeah.
And yeah, we had lions, we had hyenas, we had hippos, we had elephants, we had rhinoceros, we had scimitar cats with enormous great fangs, all living in the same climate that we have today. In fact, lions and hyenas persisted through the Ice Age, and in the Netherlands, there were lions until about 10,000 years ago. A lion is a very hardy animal. But we think of these animals as being tropical, right? And that's only because we wipe them out everywhere else. Megafaunas, ecosystems dominated by huge animals, that's the default state of all ecosystems, at land and at sea. And if an ecosystem doesn't have a megafauna, there's a reason for it, which is that humans have wiped them out.
How do we know we wiped them all out?
Sure. So it's pretty clear. It's the spread of Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, where we actually evolved, or where there had been previous forms of hominids, of early people, the animals, the large animals, have persisted. So, like in parts of Africa and parts of Asia, for instance, there's still elephants, there's still rhinos, there's still lions, tigers, and other large species, because they realized early on that we were bad news and they learned to avoid us, right? But as we spread into new lands, where they hadn't had any experience of people-like creatures before, yeah, you, right, yeah, right, you and whose army, they had no idea that we were so dangerous.
Yeah.
And you can see the spread of humans just wiping out these large animals. So, for instance, in Europe, most of the large animals were driven out by the ice into southern Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if it hadn't been for humans, when the ice retreated, they would have all come back and refilled the space, all the elephants and the rhinos and the hippos and stuff. But these were just meals on legs for humans. Look at all that meat, and they could very easily be killed. The large animals are actually easier to catch and kill than the small animals. If you look at the Americas, before humans turned up about 14,000 years ago, the Americas had this incredible fauna of enormous animals. I mean, lots of different species of elephant and mammoths. They had bison twice the size of the bison today. They had beavers 3 meters long. They had salmon 3 meters long
with beavers 3 meters long because their tail was just that long. Or
no. This was
they were just
huge
really
animal.
huge as beavers.
Huge animal.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. Different species.
Yeah.
They had a bird with a 10-meter wingspan in Argentina. All these extraordinary creatures, masses and masses. They had bears, which stood over 4 meters high on their hind legs, with enormous teeth and claws, called the short-faced bear. And the reason they were so huge and had huge teeth and claws is that they drove saber-toothed cats and giant lions off their prey and scavenged their prey. So they had to be so huge that they could drive these animals away. And all these incredible creatures. And within 1,000 years, from Alaska to Patagonia, almost the entire megafauna was wiped out. And I went to a very interesting presentation by a paleontologist, someone who studies animal remains, fossils.
Yeah.
And he was talking to anthropologists, people who study human remains. And he said, you anthropologists, you spend years trying to work out when people first arrive on a piece of land for the first time, right? And you look for flint tools and you look for fire sites and stuff. And these things are really hard to find. You don't need to bother. There's a much easier way of telling when humans arrive, because you've got all your megafauna, the bones and the tusks and things. Here they are, the fossil record, and then suddenly they're not there anymore. That's when humans arrive.
I think a very common thread throughout this conversation has been human nature and the systems that we build and that we live in. As an extension of that thread that runs throughout this conversation, what you just told me, doesn't this tell us that it is human nature to dominate nature?
There was no golden age, right? There was no state of grace. There was no time when we lived in harmony. Some indigenous people have subsequently found ways of living in a far more harmonious way, because otherwise they just destroy their own way of living. But we don't have to be what we were. This is the amazing thing about humanity, is that we can change. We can change individually and we can change socially. And we have this incredible capacity, because we've got this higher consciousness, to say we could do this differently. The way we're living now, or the way we lived in the past, doesn't have to determine the way we live in the future. We can create systems that are completely different from how we did things before. And people say, you could tell from our canine teeth we always ate meat. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, fine. Yeah, we always ate meat. Doesn't mean we have to eat meat now. We could be different. We could have a plant-based diet. To give just one example, there are massive massively different ways in which we can live. And, fascinating histories of humanity, like The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, show that we have lived in lots and lots of different ways, with lots of different political systems. Some of them highly coercive and draconian, some of them highly egalitarian. You can choose. It does not have to be this way. And what people are constantly trying to tell us, what the neoliberals have tried to tell us, what the fascists try to tell us, is there's only one way. This is the only way human beings, this is a natural law that humanity has to be like this. Bollocks to that. There is no such natural law. Just because things were done in the past in a certain way, that doesn't make it a natural law. That's how human societies behaved at a certain moment of time. As a human society today, we can behave in a completely different way. And what I want to do above all, and this is the thrust of my work, is to stimulate the moral imagination. Is to say, imagine if we did things this way. Okay, you like that idea? Then here's how we're going to do it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Calvin.